that's
nice.
How is the?
I'm sorry?
Go on, Galina. Go on. I was going to ask Samko something.
Yeah,
I was going to ask him how the course is going.
Well, you know, today it was very slow. I was not very happy. Probably students were not very happy, but the weather was not good either. But tomorrow it will be big splash after the lecture today.
Have you looked at my chapter?
Absolutely. But you know, that's for the whole semester. Yeah, I read it. It's quite a. Did you publish it?
No, I'm thinking of. I have a whole bunch of papers on the Republic that I never published, and I'm now thinking that maybe I will publish them. You know.
Yeah.
But I first have to finish the one I'm writing now.
Yeah. Okay, so slowly we have 2, 4. Well, let's see whether we have all the students. In Rorty room there is only one, Michal Giga. In Hannah Ren room, which is called Max, there are 4 or 5 people, 5 students, so that's good. Well, let's, if you don't mind, 2 minutes to fill. And
absolutely, I'm at your disposal.
I even sent the note to Herminio, but I'm sure, but he has not show up. And Randy Newell, he has a special assignment now at Carleton at this moment, so he cannot come. Otherwise, he would. So. And this is also live on Facebook, and it's recorded, so it might have, it will have some audience outside of this. Okay.
You know, I already have some response to my lecture.
Oh, do you? Did you?
Joseph sent a reply.
From he's in the States. He's in Chicago, I think.
I didn't know that.
Yes. Okay, good. Yeah. All right. Well, we have 2, 4, 5, 20 plus students inside the class. So let's start. So listen, guys, we are doing this course. Please, if you could turn off your microphones, because it would be much better reception to listen to Phil. It is an annual course of reading Plato's Republic. It was taught by Matthew Post, František Novosad, Bela Edet. I was teaching it with Novosad. I was teaching it with James Griffith, and now Cole Simmons, who is the main teacher of this course, and I are teaching it this semester, which is unusual because usually we have it in January, February. But because we hope to have a face-to-face teaching, we switched it to May, and we did a good thing, although we delayed it for a week. So we do it in the garden, and it's marvelous. And thanks for participating in these Wednesday discussions. Now, as I told to Phil, and as I discussed with Phil Azzie, this is basically kind of a lecture seminar, online Zoom seminar for the students. So they have to balance their talk to mainly focus on students, not to fellow scholar, although it's always tempting because they have just started to read Republic. But then in the discussion, you can ask those most sophisticated and secondary literature question, and we will have a discussion afterwards. Phil Azzie is a graduate from Carleton University, and as we wrote, he has been teaching in French and English for, well, I said 3 decades. Maybe I should write just 2 decades at Carleton University and Ottawa University. Mostly political philosophy, but often now he teaches the courses on Canadian theory, Canadian politics, and Canadian political theory, and Canadian politics, and then he's also has a daytime job, but his love, of course, is political philosophy, as it is all our love. So I'm glad he agreed to join us. And then I must say that I little bit put the title of his topic a little bit different. He will explain that it's not the governments but regimes, but still nevertheless it will discuss the very similar thing that as I announced. So Phil, please, the screen is yours, and then we are all looking forward to hear from you.
Thank you, Samuel. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited to participate in these sessions. I accepted with some hesitation because I'm not a Plato scholar. I don't consider myself a Plato scholar. Moreover, when I have taught Plato, and I have taught Plato, I have used the dialogues Gorgias and the Apology. I've never taught Republic. And the main reason has to do with its proportions, which I think are huge. There are so many layers and so many dimensions to it. So now that I seem to have disqualified myself from having anything meaningful to say about the work, let me say why I think it's rewarding to study Republic, because I have studied it, even if I haven't taught it. There are, of course, different views about what Republic is ultimately about. Regardless of what it might be about, it is, I think, a profound reflection on the nature of political things. And among the works of political philosophy with which I'm acquainted, I think it's unrivaled in this regard. And to give you an example of why, let me compare it briefly in two ways to what arguably is the greatest work of modern political philosophy, which is Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. First point, in comparing them, I would suggest that there is nothing fundamental in Hobbes, nothing fundamental in Leviathan or any of his other works that is not explored in Plato's Republic. On the other hand, there are things in Plato's Republic that are not explored in Hobbes's Leviathan. In other words, the Republic is the more comprehensive of the two works. And let me give you just two examples of that. First, the question about the nature of justice, which launches and underlies the whole discussion in Republic, is never raised by Hobbes. Hobbes simply begins with a definition or an understanding of justice, a steady will, he calls it, of giving everyone his own. And he builds his entire system, his entire doctrine on that understanding. Secondly, questions of rulership, such as why someone would want to rule, what constitutes good rule, the proper training or education of rulers, are not questions that are raised or addressed by Hobbes. So that's one point. Secondly, I think Plato's Republic invites us, perhaps even requires, that we participate in the exploration of the issues it explores, as if we were active participants in the discussion. As BISLA said last week, we shouldn't be passive spectators, simply accepting everything we're told as if it were simply the truth. Now, people can argue and do argue about whether or not Republic contains a definite teaching or a doctrine. But if it does, we can't find out what it is without actually participating in the exploration. Again, Hobbes is different. Hobbes has thought this through out all in advance for us. And he presents us with a final doctrine or teaching about politics. And he's quite clear in that regard that his doctrine should be taught at universities. So by the way, he'd be quite displeased that we're sitting here talking about Plato's Republic instead of talking about his Leviathan. In short, I think where Hobbes tells us what we should think, Plato guides us in terms of what we should think about. And I think those are very different and fundamentally different things. Someone telling us what to think and someone telling us what to think about. So Samuel suggested, obviously, that we discuss aspects of Plato that are relevant today. And in that regard, let me repeat what I said earlier, my impression that Republic is a profound reflection on the nature of political things. I think another way to put this would be simply that it invites us or challenges us to explore fundamental issues. And by that, I simply mean issues that don't go away, issues that can't be solved once and for all, issues that each generation of students or scholars in political science have to grapple with, unless they obviously choose to ignore them. So if there are such fundamental issues, if they're explored in Republic, then they are inevitably as relevant today as they were for Plato. And I think one of the things he invites us to think about is the importance of the regime, or what I will call regime politics. And this is what I would like to consider with you. I know that the talk is titled The Notion of Good Government, but in Plato's political philosophy, I think the notion of good government cannot be separated from issues of the regime. And so I will touch on that. So I've prepared some notes, general points. I'm not sure how long they will take, but I would, if it's a bit on the short side and I don't know yet, I hope we can take up the remaining time with discussion. So let me start simply with this idea of the regime. That the regime is a topic in the Republic is obviously simply suggested immediately by its title. The title of the work, translated in English as Republic, is Politeia, which refers to a regime or sometimes constitution. And if I remember, Sam, you said last week the Slovak translation is actually closer to the proper meaning. Now, I'm not suggesting in any way that the Republic is a treatise on regimes or regime politics. I'm suggesting that in the context of the dialogue that deals with the question, what is justice, issues related to the regime and regime politics are introduced and explored. Now, I've been using this term regime. What is it? Simply, I would say the regime is what characterizes or defines a political community that gives it a certain identity or a certain character. And it refers not only to the basic structure or architecture of a political community, for example, its basic institutions, separation of powers, charters of rights, things like that. It refers to a way of life. For example, beliefs about what constitutes a good or a well-ordered society. So a democratic regime, for example, not only includes democratic institutions and procedures such as elections, but it also fosters a democratic way of life or ideas about what constitutes a democratic way of life. I think for Plato, as for Aristotle, the regime then is the fundamental unit of analysis in any political community, because it provides the authoritative framework for the community. Now, I'm not suggesting that every political community necessarily has a regime as an ideal type. what I am saying or suggesting is that for Plato, every political community, one way or another, has a regime of sorts. So, for example, the laws of a community are not the basic unit of analysis for Plato. The laws must reflect the nature of the regime. To give a simple example, if a regime today calls itself democratic, but say the legislators institute a law that would restrict the right to vote to people with a very high income, well, that legislation would deliberately or not, consciously or not, in one way or another, start to transform that regime from a democracy into an oligarchy, the rule of the rich. So I think a basic rule for Plato when you approach political communities of any kind would be the first step, perhaps the most important in understanding that political community, is to try to figure out the nature of its regime. And this is no less true today, I would suggest, than it was in Plato's day. And let me give you or suggest a simple example. And here I'm talking directly to students. I would guess that many of you have traveled to other countries, or you're looking forward to doing so once again, once this pandemic is over. And one thing you may have done, or you may have been advised to do in advance of your travels, is to get some idea of the country you're visiting. Since when you're there, you're going to be subject to their laws. In other words, the laws of a regime that may differ from your own. Now, if you wanted to identify or figure out the type of regime in a particular country, what would you do? Where would you look? Well, one place you might look or start is the country's constitution. To the extent that it clarifies the nature of the regime, to some extent, it's a good place to look. And as you may know, the constitutions of various countries sometimes include preambles that provide a clear indication as to the nature of their regime or what they claim to be. And I want to give you two examples, starkly different examples. Saudi Arabia and France. So if you go to the Constitution of Saudi Arabia, you read the preamble, what you see is simply this. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is a sovereign Arab Islamic state with Islam as its religion. God's book and the Sunnah of his prophet are its constitution. If you look at France, the preamble states, France is an indivisible, secular, democratic, and social republic. It ensures the equality of all citizens before the law, without distinction of origin, race, or religion. It respects all beliefs. So, one is an Islamic monarchy. Another is a secular democracy. Now, I think anyone can intuit that these regimes differ from one another in terms of basic principles. And we can assume that unless the lawmakers in those two regimes are very incompetent, the laws that they legislate are going to reflect or try to reflect the basic principles of the regime as expressed in these preambles. Now, what might these laws look like? Well, in my country, in Canada, the following travel advisory is posted on our government's website concerning Saudi Arabia. Criticizing the royal family is illegal. Criticizing Islam is illegal. Religious proselytizing is not permitted. Common law relationships are illegal and are subject to severe punishment, including the death penalty. imported and domestic audiovisual media and reading materials are censored in Saudi Arabia. The law of Saudi Arabia prohibits sexual acts between individuals of the same sex. Further, it is illegal to be transgender. Those convicted may face the death penalty. Now, regardless of what anyone might think about this, about these laws, about this regime, my point in focusing on this was simply to say that I think this is a good, clear example of what Plato means by a regime or regime politics. So with that in mind, let me now turn to the Republic, that by way of a very general introduction. And I'd like to start by focusing on this idea of the city in speech, or building a city in speech. The discussion about justice, and as you know, the Republic is a discussion about justice. This discussion turns into or proceeds through the construction in speech of a just regime. Now, Socrates is not the first person to introduce or to make a connection between justice and the regime. It's Thrasymachus who does this. It's Thrasymachus who says that justice is the rule of the stronger, which he associates with the ruling body, the lawmakers. And he emphasizes that different regimes will have different laws, something that I have just suggested. Now, the city in speech that we watch or see come into being develops into a city of a particular type, with a particular character, with a particular way of life, based on beliefs about what constitutes the good or the just life. In other words, it is the construction of a regime. Now here, let's recall that the stated reason given for embarking on the construction of a city in speech is that investigating the nature of justice might be easier if we look for it first in a city. Rather than looking for it in an individual first, we turn to the city because the city is bigger. And Socrates says, so first we'll investigate what justice is like in the cities. Then almost immediately, he qualifies this by saying, if we should watch a city coming into being in speech, we would also see its justice coming into being and its injustice. So my question is this: if we're going to look for justice in the city first, why not look at an existing city? Why not look at Athens, for example, which is the backdrop for the whole discussion? Why is it necessary or important or helpful to look at a city as it is coming into being? Now, it could be that Socrates takes this approach because it's Glaucon himself who introduced that method. You may recall that Glaucon presents the account given by the many regarding the origin of justice. In other words, Glaucon says, this is how the many say justice comes into being or came into being. So it would make sense that Socrates is going to adopt the same approach. He's going to go back to the origins in his account and give an account of how justice comes into being. It's also been suggested that the entire enterprise of building a city in speech is part of the education of Glaucon and Adiamantus. What I would like to suggest as a possibility is that engaging in the imaginative act of founding a regime actually obliges us to explore and consider basic questions or issues regarding the nature and character of any political community. Now, in existing political communities, of which we are obviously all part, such issues are less likely to be raised or less likely to be evident. We tend either to ignore them, forget them, or neglect them unless something forces them onto our attention. For example, our constitutions, our fundamental legislation is for the most part something we inherit. It's something our rulers inherit, and they work with it rather than bring it into being. So it's already there in advance. And to a certain extent, therefore, it's always in the background and we don't necessarily think about it. What I think the founding or the exercise of founding a city in speech does is that it brings to the forefront some of the most basic political questions. And certainly the most basic of political questions: how should we live? What kind of people do we want our citizens to be? And I would suggest to you, what do those preambles to the French and Saudi constitutions point to, if not different answers to that fundamental question? How should we live? Now, that question, how should we live? Well, let's not overcomplicate it. It concerns the opinions, the values, the beliefs that people hold. And therefore, one reaction might be to say that these are private matters. They're not public matters. And therefore, that states or governments cannot and should not, for example, legislate morality or try to legislate morality. Or, one might react by saying, well, this kind of public involvement in private matters might be legitimate in regimes like Plato's Republic and Saudi Arabia, but not in liberal democracies. Now, I think Plato might respond to this kind of reaction in two ways. And I have no way of proving this, but this is my opinion. First, I think he might suggest that such a reaction is perfectly understandable from someone whose soul or character has been crafted in a democratic regime. That reaction is an expression of the democratic character and a defense of a democratic way of life. In other words, I think he would suggest that that reaction actually reveals the formative influence of a democratic regime. Secondly, and I think more fundamentally, I suspect Plato would say it is simply incorrect that the opinions, the beliefs, the values, the character of citizens are not the concern or the business of public authority. I think he would say that the acts of legislators are going to have a moral impact in the sense that they will condition the actions and the thoughts of the citizenry. For example, legislation that regulates the behavior of citizens, for example, by allowing, by forbidding, by encouraging certain activities, will inevitably, over time, nurture or bolster or alter habits, the character and values in a way that either sustains or undermines the regime. In other words, I think Plato is in a way very hard-headed here about legislation. I think he believes that whether through action or omission, whether accidentally or deliberately, whether consciously or unconsciously, legislators, through legislation, affect the character of their citizenry. They affect the nature of the regime. I think from a Platonic perspective, for any legislator to say that they are not concerned with the character of the citizenry amounts to denying that they do what they cannot avoid doing. And moreover, Plato might say, legislators might actually do a better job at it if they realized or admitted to themselves that this is what they are doing. And this is no less true of a democracy than of any other kind of regime. In this sense, democratic legislators are not just the servants of the citizens. They are, at least to a certain degree, the tutors, whether they like it or not, whether they know it or not. And let me refer briefly here to the dialogue I do teach, Gorgias. In Gorgias, if you've read it, you may remember that Socrates rebukes the greatest statesmen and legislators of Athens for neglecting their role as tutors. He says they focus more on making Athenians better off than making them better. And Socrates accuses them of indulging the appetites of Athenians, making Athens powerful, but not good. And Socrates suggests that the aspiring politician Callicles is not fit for political life because he has never improved anyone. Socrates says of himself that he is one of the only true politicians because he is concerned with the character of citizens. But he doesn't go into politics because he would not be listened to. Now, Socrates' view of politics seems naive in a way, judging rulers according to whether they make citizens better or worse. But if we think that, if we think Socrates is naive, if we reject this standard, then we have to ask ourselves, on what basis do we reject it? For example, do we acknowledge that politicians can make us better or worse in some ways, but that there should be some other standard for judging them? And if that's the case, then what is that standard? What do we expect from politicians or legislators? Or we can deny that legislation has an impact on the character of citizens, on the nature of the regime, which in a way implies that legislation is morally neutral in its effects. It has no moral impact, in which case we might ask, well, is that not a naive position or a naive belief, that legislation has no impact on the character of people or the character of their regime? So let me come back to an earlier point and back to Republic. The founding of the city in speech brings to the forefront the most basic of political questions. How should we live? What kind of people do we want our citizens to be? And a regime, or any regime, is in a way the authoritative or public answer to that question. And if we recognize this, then I think we start to realize, or at least we should start to consider, the extent to which the matters that Socrates focuses on in founding his ideal regime are matters that can't be ignored in any regime. For example, the issue of censorship. What do we allow people to hear, to see, or to read? The regulation of property and wealth. Legislation concerning the family. The education of the young. how we understand the common good, how to foster civic virtue, allegiance to one's community, fellow feeling among citizens, and finally, the training and the character of rulers. And here I'd like to quote a modern thinker, John Stuart Mill, who I think is very Platonic in the importance he assigns to the character of rulers and citizens in the achievement of good government. And the quote I'm going to read comes from his work, Considerations on Representative Government. So he's commenting on the importance of character in a democratic regime. And his main point is that while the institutional setup and the machinery of government are important for good government, they're not sufficient. And in explaining why, he says the following, and you'll forgive me, it's a rather long quote, but I think it's a good one. He says this, he says, of what efficacy are rules of procedure in securing the ends of justice if the moral condition of the people is such that the witnesses generally lie and the judges and their subordinates take bribes? How can institutions provide a good municipal administration if there exists such indifference to the subject that those who would administer honestly and capably cannot be induced to serve, and the duties are left to those who undertake them because they have some private interest to be promoted? Of what avail is the most broadly popular representative system if the electors do not care to choose the best member of parliament, but choose those who will spend most money to be elected? How can a representative assembly work for good if its members can be bought, or if their excitability of temperament, uncorrected by public discipline or private self-control, makes them incapable of calm deliberation, and they resort to manual violence on the floor of the House, or shoot at one another with rifles? How again can government or any joint concern be carried on in a tolerable manner by people so envious that if one among them seems likely to succeed in anything, those who ought to cooperate with him form a tacit combination to make him fail? Whenever the general disposition of the people is such that each individual regards those only of his interests which are selfish, and does not dwell on or concern himself for his share of the general interest, in such a state of things, good government is impossible. The influence of defects of intelligence in obstructing all the elements of good government requires no illustration. Government consists of acts done by human beings. And if the agents, or those who choose the agents, or those to whom the agents are responsible, or the lookers-on whose opinion ought to influence and check all these, are mere masses of ignorance, stupidity, and baleful prejudice, every operation of government will go wrong. So I think that in a way is a very Platonic understanding of the importance of character and the importance of virtue. Again, institutions are important, but institutions don't act automatically. Someone has to push the button. And one example, I'll just give you one example. Look at, the last 4 years of administration in the United States. The United States has multiple means and institutional procedures for limiting the power of a president or censoring a president. But those mechanisms don't kick in automatically. Someone has to be willing to do it. Someone has to have the character and the virtue or the courage to actually implement those various measures. The last theme I would like to introduce is, because I've been talking about the regime in the Republic, is the democratic regime as the background for the Republic. I think it's important to remember or recognize that the regime is the background or context for the dramatic action of the dialogue. The background is Athens, a city with a democratic regime. And in Book 8, I realize you may not be there yet. In Book 8, Socrates gives a description of the democratic character, of what life is like in a democracy. A regime, he says, where the way of life is based on freedom. In a democratic regime, more than any other kind of regime, he says, all sorts of human beings come to be. That includes philosophers like Socrates and teachers of rhetoric like Thrasymachus. Democracies are more receptive and amenable to such people. And you can make a clear connection, for example, between democratic politics and the receptivity to rhetoricians, teachers of rhetoric, like Thrasymachus and like Gorgias. And just to come back to Gorgias for a moment, in that dialogue where Socrates talks to him or asks him about the power of his art and whether he can teach it to others, Gorgias responds by saying, yes, I can teach it here and elsewhere, here in Athens and elsewhere. He doesn't say I can teach it everywhere. In other words, the suggestion is that there are regimes that will not be receptive to teachers of rhetoric for one reason or another, just as there are regimes that might not be receptive to philosophers like Socrates. And finally, it's also suggested in Book 8 that the democratic regime is most conducive to the kind of inquiry that Socrates has been engaged in with his interlocutors, the discussion about the best or the just regimes. Because democracy allows for all human types to appear, it also allows for all regimes, in a sense, to appear. He describes democracy as, in a sense, a great big store of regimes. Anyone shopping for regimes, anyone who wants to inquire about the nature of regimes, should do so in a democracy, because in a way, all ways of life are considered acceptable. So I've been talking now, I think, for just over half an hour, and I think I will leave it at that. That is essentially what I had to say, and I hope it's sufficient to at least generate some discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Phil. It was wonderful. Please formulate or pose your question. Reflect on what either what Phil was defining what regimes are, or how they evolved during the Plato's times and in modernity, and what does it mean for our own regimes. I might start with the question that touches, Phil, on the last point you made, that democracy is kind of a well of not various regimes, but where all kinds of regimes are discussed or have some kind of be allowed to be discussed. Is it as if city of speech or regimes in speech are allowed in democracy. Of course, not to be implemented there, although that can happen through elections. And that it is dangerous, that you know the democracy can turn in one of those.
I think that is, you know, an important consideration, and clearly it's something that I think comes up. I don't think you need to be particularly or engage in any kind of sophisticated analysis to realize, first of all, that democracy in a way, or a democratic regime, allows people to discuss, if not propose, types of society or systems that are less democratic or non-democratic, right? You know, that is what, again, the Athenian regime allows Socrates to do. The regime he proposes in speech is certainly not democratic, but democracy, in a sense, allows that kind of discussion to take place. And I'm sure it takes place all the time in democratic regimes here, in Slovakia and elsewhere, right? And the, you know, the issue or the concern is, you know, can democracy or can, through popular will, people decide that they don't want a democratic regime anymore? Right. So yes, it is, you know, an issue that is considered. It can be just a topic of discussion. Is democracy actually the best regime? Or it could be proposed seriously.
Can I ask you something, Phil?
Yeah. Before Bella, before you ask, could I ask if you want to raise a question? Just put your hand, and I can see who wants to speak. So then I can give you a opportunity. Bella, please.
Well, thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it, even though I have some reservations. Reservation starts with your naming Hobbes as the greatest modern political thinker. I would name Hegel, and I think Hegel is a much more all-round political thinker. I think Hobbes is perhaps one of the greatest liberal political thinkers. The reason I mention Hegel is I don't share your optimism about democracy. I hate to tell you, but without sort of espousing it as a political form, I tend to lean towards constitutional monarchy of the Hegelian type, where you have a clear decision maker informed by a group of knowledgeable, committed civil servants, and you have a legislature that represents the interest of society at large. And you see, I'm very, very much more perhaps than you, very, very scared of what's happening today, because for me, today's democracy is leaning towards a kind of mindless populism. And I think the debate about Facebook and social media, and I think neither you nor I are on social media, and I'm not on it for very good reason, is that it allows the stupidity, the innate stupidity of people to dominate discussion. And I think unless you have some sort of a rule, some sort of a control over the nature of discussion, it will tend towards populism and tyranny, as we see it's going all over the world. So I think I would be far more, I think, sympathetic to Plato's communitarianism than you seem to be. And as a last thought, I think the genius of the soul city analogy, as I mentioned last time, part of it is to see the soul as a political structure, but I think it's also to see the dynamic interrelationship between the regime and its citizens.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's not simply the education of citizens. I think it's also the structuring and running of the state. And one last thing, just one last thing, Phil. The very last passage of the Republic, because I think the end of the Republic is Book 9, 592, which sounds to me very Kantian in a sense, because it says, well, Glaucon says, how he brings the question up again. How is this ever going to this Sicilian speech? And Socrates flirts with a kind of a Kantian notion of the kingdom, a kingdom of ends, which is to say, make sure that you realize this within your own soul. And having realized that, and here I'm sort of extrapolating a little bit, there's the chance that in rational discussion with others, like-minded people, such as yourself, you are able to spread this into other souls. Mm-hmm. So I think for Plato, it's very important. That's why the quote I use, that the crowd cannot be philosophy. It's very important for Plato, not just to have discussion. For me, Hegel is very right. Hegel says free speech is to be both respected and despised, because free speech is to be despised if it is free speech as we see it now on social media. Free speech is not free unless it is under some form of control, as I believe freedom is not freedom until and unless it is under some form of control. Anyways, I'm going to stop now.
No, and Bela, I absolutely agree with everything you said, which leads me to ask, what is it that I said that made you think that I was optimistic about democracy? Because I agree with everything you say.
Well, I heard sort of the undercurrent of saying, reminded me of Bloom's thesis, actually, that he's saying that quite, I think, quite provocatively, that it's a praising of democracy, because it is only in a democracy that Socrates would be possible. So in a sense, I thought you were saying that democracy is the greatest regime because it allows freedom. And my view is that, and in the Statesman, Plato makes moves in this direction. Democracy is not worth anything unless it is a lawful democracy. Mm. Democracy is not worth anything unless it is ruled by laws. And I would put more emphasis on being ruled by laws and being ruled by lawmakers and being ruled by wise rulers than democracy as such, because democracy as such, as I think Plato sees it, can very easily degenerate into a form of libertarianism. Mm-hmm. And that's what I thought you were perhaps a little too generous with democratic regimes, you know?
No, I didn't, and I didn't mean to be, actually, which is, yes, it allows for free speech, clearly, but like any other regime, it is, I think, for Plato, no less subject to the necessity of a kind of soul crafting. And for example, you can't allow, yes, the danger in democracy, as we see today, is that it degenerates into populism. And so, I think, one of the best descriptions of populism is, I think, in Book 6 of Republic, where, Socrates talks about the great beast. Mm-hmm. And politicians who adapt themselves to the nature and character of that mm-hmm. great beast. They know what excites it. They know what pacifies it. They know how to pander to it. So no, I agree with you completely. And that democracy without laws, without, first of all, the basic constitutional framework, but also without some kind of, well, to give one of the examples I gave, and I think relates to Facebook, some kind of censorship. I mean, so it's nonsense, first of all, to look at it if you look at it very hard-headedly, it's nonsense to say that democracies don't engage in censorship. They do. We have censorship laws. You know, you can't read child pornography. You can't bring it into the country. That at a very basic level. But I think it goes as well to the issues you raise, and that, you know, if you don't want to answer the question, you can't deny the validity of the question. What do you do with Facebook? What do you do with media like that? Do you just leave it completely unregulated? So no, I think that those are important issues that have to be considered in a democracy. And, you know, and that's one of the reasons I thought I wanted to emphasize that the exploration of the city in speech raises issues that don't apply simply to an ideal regime. They apply to every kind of regime, including democracies. So I agree with you. And like you, yes, I'm not on Facebook and I'm not going on Facebook.
Okay. Yeah. Dear students, has anybody either at Hannah Arendt's room or Roti room or anyone from the class have any question? Yes, Lucas Zibela, please. You have to unmute.
Hello, I have a question for Phil. It was mentioned that the laws aren't the unity of politics or political communities. I would like to ask, maybe I misheard it, but how it is possible since the laws are highly connected with the politics?
Could you repeat that or reformulate that, Lucas? I just want to make sure that I understand the question.
Yes, you mentioned that the laws aren't unity of politics or the political communities at the beginning. And I would like to ask why, because maybe I misheard it, because I think that they are highly connected and they were highly connected even in that times.
Yes, absolutely. I'll try to repeat what I think I said, and you tell me if it answers your question and if it's clear. When Plato talks about legislation, and I think that for Plato, ultimately, as for Aristotle, there is a fundamental dignity to legislation, the art of legislation, or the science of legislation, the basic laws of any political community, putting that in place, because everything else is going to be based on that. And that provides the overarching, the comprehensive, or you know, what they might call the architectonic structure of the political community. Every political community is structured in a fundamental way by basic laws. That is part of the regime. So, you know, and as it relates to the character of a political community, the laws are influential. They will contribute to the character of the community. And so, yes, it's absolutely inseparable from the political community. And you know, to give an example, you know, when you focus on the regime, to the extent that the regime as fundamental law is important, you can ask two basic questions about any regime, because not surprisingly, there are different types of regimes. So of course, Plato and Aristotle never talk of regime in the singular, they talk about regimes. So one question for any political community is, you know, what do you want to be? What do you say you are? How do you define your community? And then a fundamental political question would be, okay, do your laws, and especially your fundamental laws, structure your community in such a way that you are what you say you are. If you want to be a democracy or a democracy of a particular type, then do the laws you have in place actually conduce to that? Do they help or do they hurt? The other question you can ask is, well, we'll look at different political communities. We will compare regimes. And when you do that, again, you're not simply comparing institutions, you're comparing, or you might compare ways of life. And then you have to make a choice, right? Which regime do you prefer? Where would you prefer to live? So I don't know if that answers your question, Lucas, but yes, I think there is a fundamental connection between the two. No political community is so fluid and so amorphous that it doesn't have to be structured and isn't structured by basic laws or fundamental legislation.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. Please, another question for Phil or a comment? Can we figure?
I have a question.
Yes, yes.
This was kind of a side comment you made, so I'm not sure if I interpret it correctly, but it struck me that you might have claimed that if there is such a thing as the regime, the legislators will not merely be servants of the people. Is that, do you think that's right, or am I just saying it wrong?
Oh, I think that was in the context of a democratic regime. And I think what I suggested was that as I was, when I responded to BISLA, I said that, you know, these fundamental issues or concerns, for example, with character, that this is as important in a democratic regime as in any other regime. So that I think my point was that democratic politicians, in a way, in a sense, would be shirking their responsibility, to put it crudely, if they only ever claim that they are servants to the people. That in a very real way, whether they want to or not, whether they accept the responsibility or not, they are also, I think I used the word tutors. In other words, what they do or don't do is going to have an impact on, you know, the character of the citizenry, to put it crudely. I think that's what I wanted to say. So I don't know if that if that clarifies anything, or if it leads to a subsequent question.
Yes, a subsequent question. So my basic question then is, do you think there is such a regime where those who represent the people are their servants? Or is that merely a sort of facade?
My top of mind reaction is that I think they, in a lot of democracies, the ones I'm familiar with, and in particular my own, they are servants in the very basic, perhaps crude sense that they tell people what they want to hear. They tell people what they want to hear, and particularly, for example, during elections. So in that sense, they are servants of the people. Now, you could say, and I think it would be right to say that, you know, they should be servants of the people in the sense that they should be concerned with their not just their well-being materially, you know, are you better off than you were 4 years ago, for example, but with their psychological well-being. And I think that's what, in a sense, Socrates says. And one of the reasons he says he's one of the only politicians, true politicians, is that he actually is concerned with that, but he can't go into politics because people won't listen to him. So I think they, you know, there are two, in a sense, approaches to what it means to be a servant. Servant in the sense that you simply tell people what you think they want to hear, and servant in that in a sense, you tell them what you think they need to know, to put it crudely. And I think, in that sense, just to come back to the dialogue Gorgias, I think Socrates is not simply being, naive or ironic or simple-minded when he says that actually rhetoricians don't have power. They're not powerful. Because if you simply tell people what you think they want to hear, if you simply pander to them, then you're not exercising any power. You're not persuading people if you simply tell them what it is they want to hear. Which is why Socrates says, I wouldn't be surprised if I was brought up on charges, right? And what it would amount to, what the trial would amount to, would be a jury of children who are being, or the accusation brought by a pastry chef before a jury of children condemning the doctor, right? That's what it amounts to. And in that sense, I think it's a very, in a way, apt description of a lot of what goes on in democratic politics today. I mean, I guess the question for me is, and it's a question I'm throwing out, is, to what extent should we hold politicians, if not legislators, responsible for the character of democracy? If they, if you don't want to say, well, they can make us better or worse, is it fair to say they've made us more cynical? They've made us less concerned about the public good or the common good? Is it, to use Platonic terms, is it healthy in a democracy that during an election, close to half of the population don't even bother to vote? If you were to diagnose the health of a democratic regime on the basis simply of the number of people who show up at elections and exercise their right, you might come to a conclusion that this is a sick or unhealthy political regime. Again, these are just questions I'm throwing out. I have no definite answer, and I don't know if it answers or addresses what you were asking, Cole, so please feel free to follow up.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are students who would like to ask a question, and then we'll get back to Cole, I'm sure. But we are also testing the system from the Hannah Arendt room, which is actually called Max.
Okay.
So can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Okay, great. So Mr. Elliott has said that, quote, the democracy is becoming mindless populism because of the social media and so on. So this is a joint question for both Mr. Azzie and Mr. Elliott. What do you think is the end goal for democracy and for the current age, and how shall we or shall not we reform the system?
I'm sorry, can you repeat what is the end goal of democracy?
Yes, is it, are we ought to think about the current democratic, not institution, but settings as end to itself, or are there end to themselves, or is there any way to reform them or to change it completely to some different system?
That's a very big question. Bela, do you want to go first, or let me start just by, I think if you take legislation seriously, as I think Plato says, you must, right? Politics is not just about the deliberative aspect. The fundamental, the most important political art for Socrates, for Plato, as for Aristotle, is the legislative function, the fundamental legislation. And then you have the deliberative. And by the way, I may be unfair here. It's been a while since I've read Hannah Arendt. But I think she, especially when she talks about politics in Aristotle, she lays much too much emphasis simply on the deliberative element, coming together in public and debating in the assembly. I think she downplays the importance of fundamental legislation. So with that in mind, just a kind of first very basic answer to your question, I think I would suggest that there are aspects of populism that can be addressed and can be controlled through legislation. You know, one very basic way is censorship. Some form of regulation or control of what people can say. Now, we do that again in democracies all the time. In my country, we have laws against hate speech, for example. We have laws against, as I said, the importation of certain forms of pornography. So democracy is not just a free-for-all. There are fundamental and available ways to regulate public discourse. Now, do people and do politicians have the will or the courage or the intelligence to do that? And of course, it's a fundamental question, how do you go about doing that? Then the question is, what do you actually do? Now, the problem is, I think, the more you let the problem develop without addressing it, the harder it is ultimately to address it. So if you have, if democracy is degenerating into populism, there may come a certain point where, yes, it's now become such an acute problem that there may be no way to actually address it adequately. But again, this comes back to we'll call it the wisdom or the intelligence of legislators. They have to, in a sense, have the big picture. I'll leave it at that for now. Bela, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, let me make sure I understood the question. Are you asking specifically about Facebook, or are you asking specifically, more generally, rather, about the regime that we live under today? This I'm addressing to the student who asked the question.
I am addressing the question in a more general matter.
Well, you see, I believe that we cannot make any a priori statements about what is the best regime. I think the regime that we live under could be the best regime if it moved in the direction of other regimes. And indeed, I think it has to do with laws, it has to do with ideology. And I just wanted to start by saying that both for Plato and Aristotle, the law is an essential educational factor, that we educate people through legislation, through the laws we have. And if I can come to the more general question, I think one of the problems, as I see in the United States, is their constitution. In other words, I mean, we could say that, yes, it would be better if the constitution ruled rather than people ruled. But I have a feeling that one of the problems in the United States is with the Constitution. It's become a kind of an idol. The Second Amendment, the absolute freedom. And I think that that to me is where one should start. Whether it is possible to revise the United States Constitution, whether it is possible to do away with this notion that anybody who doesn't like what the government does can formulate a militia and arm themselves. I mean, this is so basic to the American Constitution that I find really, really problematic. And if people live under this notion of what their country is about, then you have stuff like Facebook. Then you have stuff like untrammeled, unconstrained capitalism, because one of the problems of Facebook is capitalism, is the fact that Facebook is a profit-making organization. It's a private organization, and it's not just the people who are on Facebook, but the very Facebook is protected. It's protected by certain fundamental privacy laws in the United States, capitalist privacy laws, that you cannot interfere with a corporation's right to make its profit any way it wants to do it. Anyways, I'm going to stop ranting now. Okay. I think the question is, I don't think we should look at major changes, you know. Even Hegel said that the great age of democracy was in Athens around the time of the Persian Wars, and it degenerated from there. I mean, I think we use democracy as a key word. I think what we want is accountability, responsibility, discipline, et cetera, and whatever regime provides that is the one that is the best, I think. Mm-hmm. And in my lecture, last week, I said that it's one of the role, and I agree 100% with Phil. One of the roles of a good government is to make it possible for people to have true autonomy, true freedom. I think one of the greatest role a government has in respect to the individual is to not to give him freedom, this unrestrained freedom, which is horseshit basically, is to give him the sense of freedom that will allow them to have autonomy, to allow them to live in accordance with who they are, live in accordance with who they relate to others. Anyways.
I have a follow-up question. You've said that there are some minor changes you propose. Can you specify and name some changes which are needed to, or which you see as are necessary to be passed?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, speaking as a Canadian, I don't really believe that there's some deeply fundamental changes needed in Canada. I think Canada basically has a very decent constitution, has very decent form of government. There are sometimes there are. I'm troubled by the United States and its dominant role, both as an ideological model and as a political economic model in the world. I'm bothered by that. And I'm also bothered by the rise of populism. And I think that's a long story, but I mean, one can understand if the government doesn't address your needs, and in fact, in your view, it goes against your needs, that you have this unlawful, brainless opposition to it. I don't know if I answered your question. Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't. Yes, go ahead.
No, I was going to follow up and try to give an example in answer to the question with a focus on fundamental law. Now, this is something that I think will never happen in the United States because it would require an amendment to the Constitution that would never get passed. But I'm going to talk about our country, and not that it's necessarily better, but to give you an example, both Canada and the United States have a Bill of Rights in their Constitution. We call ours the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They have a Bill of Rights. They're different in the sense that our Charter of Rights is closer to the European model, which is that the first section of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms states that all of the rights are subject to reasonable limits prescribed by law as are compatible with a free and democratic society. So the regime has been identified. We're a liberal democracy, which is why we have a Charter of Rights. But those rights are subject and can be subject to certain limits. In the United States Charter of Rights and Freedoms, there is no such limitation clause, which, for example, I think explains why Canada has hate laws, the United States does not have hate laws, or it's much more difficult to establish, hate laws. So, a change, you were asking what changes might take place. Well, one change might be that they amend their constitution by stating or declaring that rights are subject to certain limitations. But I don't think it will ever happen. But that just by way of an example. But again, the point is, these are fundamental questions of legislation. And we can ignore them. We can say they're too complicated. We can say that no one will agree about, what to do, but it doesn't mean that they're not important. So I don't know if that answers the question from the Hannah Arendt room, but that's at least an example. It may not be the best one, but it's an example.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the other people who are watching, please, you can also write your question, and I can read it to Phil. And I just want to respond to the first thing that Marcus mentioned, whether there is some kind of end point or end of democracy. Well, it would be contradiction to democracy itself. It cannot have an end point. It's actually one of the definition of democracy or liberal democracy is that it cannot have the final point to reach. It's the other regimes that wish that the communist regimes or fascist regimes or some other fundamentalist ideological regime. But actually, democracy insists that the end point cannot be. It can only have the decent condition and then watch those conditions. Because as soon as you are heading for or formulating the end point, you have to abolish lots of things that exist today in order to reach those endpoints, and that's a crucial aspect of liberal democracy. Phil, you could add or refute what you think, because this is an important point, and that's what makes democracy rather fragile, because it cannot state in those strong words where we want to get at the end. There is no end. As soon as there is an end, it's no longer a liberal democracy.
No, I think that's very important, Sam, and I would agree with that. One of the things I'd like to re-emphasize, because we've been focusing on democratic politics, and I think it's important to keep in mind, is that the democratic regime has no less access to, say, certain measures, a certain authority in terms of in a sense, fostering a certain spirit, a certain character than any other type of regime. It may do so in certain ways, but again, those fundamental issues that are raised by Socrates in the development of the ideal city, those are issues that any democracy faces or has to face as well. And you can reject, obviously, the actual proposals that are made. For example, abolition of the family, abolition of the private family. But democracies also bring in laws that certainly regulate the family, that regulate family relations. And I'll give you a simple example, at least again in Canada. our federal government, because we are a federal system, we have central government and provincial governments, our federal government has the constitutional authority to regulate matters related to marriage, including the definition of marriage. Now, for centuries, if not for millennia, you could say marriage was defined as the union of a man and a woman. Well, our definition of marriage is that no, same-sex marriage is legitimate. So that's a simple example, I think, but I think it reminds us that in liberal democracies, we also have the capacity to regulate those kinds of things Socrates is talking about. If we don't go so far, obviously, as to abolish the family, there are certainly ways in which legislation in a democracy regulates the nature of the family, certainly the nature of the marital relationship. So I think it's important just to keep that in mind, that there are legislative means available in democracies to regulate the character and the nature of the democracy. And so,
can I say something, Phil?
Yes, go ahead. I was just going to end by coming back to the idea of populism and saying that, again, this is not something, the regulation of which is beyond the purview of a democracy. If it chooses to do so, it can do it. And I think it should. Sorry.
So listen, I have 2 points. One is to you, Phil. Please don't say that Plato in the Republic advocates the abolition of the family. First of all, he never advocates the abolition of the family in most people. And indeed, if you accept my view of there being 2 republics, in the beginning, he doesn't even advocate abolition of the family for the guardians even. He says they should have no private property.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a debate about the text, okay? But the more important point I want to make is I don't understand why you didn't respond to Samka. I mean, Samka, you use this weasel term that a democracy should not have an end point. Are you advocating that a democracy must of necessity be purely procedural and there should be no goals, there should be no substantive goals? Because if that's what your position is, I strongly disagree. And I think Phil has to disagree because Phil believes that it's one of the roles of a regime to make it possible to lead the good life. It has to do with character of individuals. So that has to be one of any regime, even a democracy, has to have some substantive goals, not a final endpoint, but a goals that yes, we do want to make people better. We want to make them more virtuous, more free, more autonomous. So I don't see what you mean by endpoints. I mean, and if you mean goals, then I think you're absolutely wrong. If you mean some predetermined final end result, then you're right. But which one do you have in mind?
Well, Phil, do you want to, or shall I respond? Then you.
Well, no, I answered in response on the assumption that was the assumption. Mm-hmm. But no, I agree. Obviously, that democracy is not purely procedural. It's obviously substantive. And there's no end goal in that sense, but clearly, yes. And one of the fundamental assumptions of democracy is freedom. And yes, a democracy that doesn't work towards fostering that is not a democracy or is a defective democracy.
Mm-hmm. What I had in mind was that most ideologies and the regimes that follows those other ideologies, they have the ideal regime that they wish to reach. They are not there. Socialism would not call themselves communism, and of course the Nazis would also says that we will reach our final destination after we clear everyone else who is in our way. And this is also for example, the regime that are driven by nationalism or religion. the democracy doesn't have that the final golden ideal state. And the reason is that in order to have it even in theory, then they would have to abolish lots of things existing now, including the freedoms, because in order to reach something that is ideal would undermine the condition now. And when I said, well, I didn't use the word procedural, but the democracy should guarantee freedoms of its citizens and what it takes, the independence of the institution, free president, so on and so forth. These are the fundamental structure that has to coexist. Well, if you want to call it procedural, fine with me. If not, that's fine. But these are the conditions that you call the regime a democracy or liberal democracy. But what I was saying, that it doesn't have the final ideal goal as its aim for the future.
Can I jump in, maybe? I would say that the final aim of liberal democracy is somewhat elusive because it's the independence of the individual citizens. And when the government's trying to make individual citizens independent, then it appears, or at least the surface level appearance of it makes it seem like it's open to any lifestyle or any sort of ideology. And I think that that's because the original foe of liberal democracy was theocracy. And so we had to create a sort of myth of tolerance so that people put religious sectarianism aside and got down to the business of material and political independence. So I would say there's an end to democracy, but the end is the independence of the individual citizen.
If you want to call it an end, that's fine. But it's not the end of the, let's say, of theocracy or a communist regime or a fascist regime or a regime that is very strictly nationalistic. That unless our race is here, we will not reach that goal. But anyway, well, is there from someone from students last question that or anyone, the guests who are listening, please have a try to pose a questions on the wonderful lecture that Phil provided. Anyone? Luka Zihonides, Milan Valaszczyk, Damian Karas, whoever. Is anybody? Who will crack first? Paulina, no?
I guess I do have a question. I'm not exactly sure how relevant it is, but I just want to ask if you're familiar with Jason Brennan and his article on epistocracy. I'm not sure if it's his notion.
I personally I'm not familiar with it. What is it?
It's basically a government that's ruled by the wise. So I guess someone could argue that Plato's philosopher king is a form of epistocracy. But the wise is kind of a broad term for it. I would say it's a rule of the people that, okay, only the people that are allowed to vote are those that can give sufficient reason behind their vote and know what they're voting for, and they're familiar with how politics work and the party that they're voting for, I would say. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's also still very underexplained, but if that's how much I remember it. So.
Right. I can't comment on that, but clearly and historically, even in so-called democracies, certainly at various stages, there were limitations on who could vote, right? It could be a property qualification, right? You had to have so much property. Or obviously, the more obvious one, women not being allowed to vote. And so that obviously is an issue in any democracy. What are, if any, the limitations on participation? Now, I think the problem, or one of the key problems, is not that in a democracy, because we effectively have universal suffrage, but the fact that having achieved that, so many people decide for one reason or another not to participate, not to exercise. And I think that comes back to the notion of the health and the character of the democracy itself. Now, that doesn't mean that the other issue, I think the other issue is still important, and unfortunately, and not to pick repeatedly on the United States, but one of the things we're seeing now in the United States, and whether it's an effect of the results of the last election or not, is an effort, it seems, to disenfranchise people once again, right? To prevent certain people from voting. Another problem that has to be addressed.
Okay, well,
Thank you.
okay. Well, listen, Phil, thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you everyone who joined in, the students, but also the guests and the former students and friends. And I'm glad that Bella Edit came as well, and then hopefully for the next week or week afterwards, when the other speaker will come, that all of you will join in, and then we will discuss the issue regarding Plato's Republic. And those who are at BISLA, you are welcome for a glass of wine. And those who are not, you are welcome to your fridge to reach for a glass of wine. Phil, I know you are in your office, so you are not even have that privilege. And then there is a lockdown, so you have to wait until the evening. But thanks a lot, and all the best. And I hope to see you all next week for another debate on Plato's Republic.
Thank you, Sam. Again, it was a pleasure, and thank you all for participating.
Hi, Phil.
Okay.
Phil.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I send you a paper? I'd like your views on it. It's a paper, it's in the process of being published, but I'd like to have your views on it.
I'd be happy to. Thank you.